Welcome to First Baptist Church and our Holy Week meditations, reflections on the last words of Jesus. This has been a long-standing tradition in the Christian community to actually have reflections on those last words, the distillation of his heart, as it were, as he was on the cross. This week we are privileged to have members of the church and community sharing in this exercise of faith and this walk towards the cross in preparation for Easter. In the theme of the week, what we're finding is that as we are meditating and having the scripture speak to us about what Jesus' last words were, we're focusing on how the sufferings have helped him to understand us. Now, that's not a new thing. We hear from the book of Hebrews how we have a high priest who, like us in every way, was tempted and suffered, but without sin. And sometimes we focus so much on the man of sorrows, we forget that he was also a man of joy who brought healing and strength and redemption. Certainly the people who were cleansed of leprosy or released from the power of sin wouldn't go away sorrowful, but with joy. In fact, there's some traditions who thought Jesus took the work that he did too lightly. If you'll remember, he was accused by some in his day of being a drunkard and a glutton. And don't forget that some of the parables that he told were just downright funny to the first century hearers. At this moment, though, we're focusing on how this man of sorrows and his sufferings have opened up a dimension of him understanding us, because who of us has not felt abandoned? Who of us has not struggled with forgiveness? Or our earthly body of thirst in our own lives? It's notable for us to go on this journey with Jesus before Easter and to understand that the person to whom we pray is compassionate and empathetic and sympathetic, who understands us. I leave you with this story as an introduction, a true story of a man who is in our Bible study, and his son had been killed in Vietnam. And in our Bible study, he was wrestling with, where's God? Where was God when my son was killed? Where was my God when my son was lost in the mountains and we were not able to recover his body? All of us have had similar deliberations and questions about, is God good? Is God really there? Does God really love us? Well, another veteran in that group who also had the horror of having lost a child to war was the only one who could answer him with anything direct. He said God was in the same place he was when his own son was killed. It is this God who we are introduced to, I pray, in a new way this week in the meditations from the cross. A God who really understands us and knows us and loves us and redeems us. God bless you and enjoy the study today. Welcome again to our Lenten Luncheon Meditations. Hope you're being blessed by the others who are lending their voices to this Holy Week meditation. I'm going to be speaking and reflecting on the last words of Jesus that have to do with a conversation, as it were, on the cross between people who are hanging there in agony. Let me just turn to the Gospel according to Luke, the 23rd chapter, and let you overhear Dr. Luke's conversation. There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at Jesus. "Aren't you the Christ? Well, save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God? Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly. For we're getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing. And then he turned and said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answers him, I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise. In these uncertain times, I've been having a lot of conversations with people who are intensely fearful. Their anxiety levels are high, and there are conversations with people with whom I've reconnected and who are pondering the meaning of life when maybe the busyness of life has made them dull or confused, or at the very least, distracted from ultimate questions and ultimate considerations. One of the considerations that we as believers often have trouble with in the life of the church is there an afterlife? And what is it like? And what does it mean to us? Believing in life after death is probably one of the most problematic conversations that I have with people of faith, and also people who are still trying to discern whether the Christian faith has value for them or not. The consideration of what is it that goes on beyond this place? Is there really meaningful life in any certain way, or is there just a cessation, a stopping? Is it just an end? Is it an endless darkness? Is it a complete disconnect from all existence? And those considerations are held by some of the most profoundly, deeply religious, faithful people that have come through history. Saint Therese of Lisieux in France, a Carmelite nun who's known as the little flower, would oftentimes write, "You don't understand the unimaginable darkness into which I've plunged." Even Mother Teresa wondered about the afterlife, and what did it really hold for those who are being faithful? Is it a reward system? Is it something that I will be able to experience and say, I recognize others who've gone before? Is it a grand community and a reunion of some sort? And even though we often shore up and buck up and say and put on a brave face, I've been around too many hospital beds in almost 40 years of ministry. I've been around too many beds of people who were being ushered into a different life, or the ending of this one, to ignore the fact that some people are just terrified. There's some who I've watched in the quiet moments of slipping away, or as what I've become more comfortable saying in my own life, transitioning from this life to another, whatever that looks like for them, that may terrify them. Some are welcoming, and some people see things that give them assurance and reassurance. But I don't want to talk about the folklore of the moment. I don't want to talk about just my experience around others. I want us to look at the last words, as we are doing this week, at the last words of a dying man. When we are in that moment of death, when we are in that moment of facing our own mortality, what I have found most present is that the words that people speak when they have breath to speak are words that have been distilled in their hearts and they view as crucial. Now let's keep in mind, as we've been reminded from other speakers this week, these words are not spoken in the quietness around a campfire with the disciples. These words are not ones that have been polished up in the stained glass of a cathedral or in the glistening white stone light of the temple. These are words that are being spoken through agonizing moments of having to press up on nails and take a breath. I think it's important for us to understand that when the gospel writers, all four of them, say, and they crucified him, that it was written into a context where people very well understood what all of that meant. We have sanitized the cross, we have made it gold, we have made it in precious metals. There are parts of the Christian community who still show Jesus on the cross, and others say, no, we don't have him on the cross because he's resurrected. The cross itself has in some ways been sanitized from the cruelty and the brutality that it really embraced. The nails, the flesh, the awkward posture into which the body was pushed, because the person was going to die a slow death, usually by asphyxiation. And so for a person to speak, he would have to push up on nails that had been cruelly nailed, on nails with his feet crossed, to push up in order to exhale enough to breathe, to be able to speak. So in these meditations and in this moment right here, there's an effort that's going to take place because Jesus is speaking an important word for us, his important last dying words to us. In this conversation, maybe around the cross, as we have in the gospel writers, we see the soldiers, we hear the clamoring of people who are crying because of the people who are being crucified on either side, and also the women around Jesus' feet. And he would have been near enough to the ground for him to see, and we will hear from others about another conversation between a disciple, John, and his mom. But in this moment, it's not silent. There's the noisy sound of people gathered around, the hurling insults of religious leaders, the sound of animals perhaps, the soldiers laughing and mocking. And in the midst of this, one of the criminals, and I want us to lean into that notion of who these people who were crucified on either side of Jesus. They were not just thieves. Thievery in itself was not a capital offense. There are some translations that show that they were social disruptors. Maybe they were people who had rebelled against Rome in some way, that they were inciting riots, or that they had begun an insurrection kind of movement. But they were not just simple thieves of apples and oranges or stealing. That's why the translation, the criminals on either side of him, are important, and that they were sentenced to death. And in this moment, in the middle cross, there's an insult that is hurled from one of those criminals in the anger and the angst and the anguish of that crucifixion. If you are God, if you are, or even more to the point, aren't you the Christ? Then save yourself. And by the way, go ahead and save us. And while that's a very human and very poignant moment, and these are brief meditations on which I would like to keep it brief, but there's a longer study in that maybe at another time we'll delve more deeply into it. But at this moment, the other criminal from the other side rebukes his partner in crime, reminds him that we're getting what we deserve. You see, most of us have that sense of justice, that people need to get what they deserve. We build our justice systems around that there's a penalty, there's a consequence, there's a punishment. And this particular thief just had accepted the brutal facts that, yes, we're getting what we deserve. But there was a watching, it seems. We don't know if he ever had seen Jesus in another context. We don't know if he had ever heard any of Jesus' teachings. We don't know if he ever stood at the edge of the crowd wondering, man, he's on to something. As far as we know, this is their first meeting. As I said, I've watched a lot of people die and been with them on the holy ground of that transition. And not only do people's words get distilled and whatever they want to say and their breath and their parting breaths, you need to listen and lean in closely and hear the message of a dying man. It may also be something that this criminal next to Jesus had been watching how he was dying. He would have been close enough to Jesus to hear the other 7 sentences, the other 6 sentences that he would utter from the cross. He would have been there to see him and observe him saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, or it is finished, or I thirst, that have been considered thus far. Sometimes watching how a person dies is as powerful or impactful as hearing what they say. But whatever it was that moved this one criminal's heart, he started the conversation by rebuking his friend and reminding him that he had seen something about this man Jesus that prompted him to declare, we're getting what we deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. He's done nothing wrong. Jesus is fully human, and you'll hear Heather McIntyre from First Pres talk about his humanity and his thirst. And you'll hear that in the midst of this life, he was in true anguish. It was not some play-acting anguish. It was not some surreal anguish. He was suffering from the brutal blows of flogging and now the anguish of the nails. His suffering was also something that was also opening his life up to the people around him. We're told that Jesus' suffering in this Holy Week helped him to understand us more. His whole mission had been that he had been sent by the Father to seek and save the lost. He had come to save the world, not to condemn the world. His whole life mission, from the time he unrolled the scroll in Isaiah and said that the good news was going to be pronounced and that it was going to be liberty to the captives and sight to the blind, his whole life trajectory was to this moment. And his sufferings were giving him even deeper dimensions into who we are. I take us back to the question that we as believers often, with which we wrestle. Is there something on the other side? Is there something that helps us to bear up during the times that we're going through suffering, even suffering like today's? And I know that there are those who are questioning, is there really hope for life after life? Jesus had taught before. He had uttered before hints and glimpses when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And Mary and Martha had come to him, and when Woody taught about this, he said, I am the resurrection and the life, and those who believe in me will never die. Will never die. But we see people die. We see believers die. We see people who have been martyred. What does that mean that they shall never die? Or again in John 14, where Jesus is with his disciples, just the evening before this horrific act and experience in which he's plunged, he says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And where I am, you shall be also. But now, in the anguish of the garden, where he prayed for this cup to be passed from him, in the anguish of the cross and the abandonment, a thief, a criminal, who also had pressed up on nails to come to the defense. Now, it's, to me, an interesting thing. Disciples, religious leaders, people who had been followers of Jesus, his disciples, those who had called him master, those who had called him rabbi, those who had called him teacher, were nowhere to be found for his defense. And the only one who comes to his defense is a criminal who must also push up on nails to speak and say, he has done nothing wrong. And he turns to Jesus. And I want us to not miss this incredibly beautiful moment. He says, Jesus. Think about it for a moment. He calls him Jesus. By this time in Jesus' ministry, everybody was calling him rabbi, master, teacher, something. And there's a familiarity when you use someone's name. And maybe it was in that tone, maybe it was in that moment of anguish and anxiety, even in Jesus' own heart. Maybe it had been a very, very long time before he had ever been called Jesus. Maybe it had been a long time since he had heard his own name called, and in the haze of the dying time, he remembers his mom. Jesus, come on in now. Or his dad, Joseph, who had long been gone. Come on, Jesus, we got to finish this table. Something about the criminal just using his name, Jesus. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. For most of us, we are sentient beings, and that's a big word that just means that we typically only will believe and accept and adopt things that we can experience through our senses: smell, hear, taste, touch, see. And in this moment, Jesus assures this lost, last straggling sheep, in one last act of the Messiah, the Anointed One, of rescue, says to him, and he says to us, and I hope that we can do that. We can really just take this in, because Jesus is not a liar. Jesus is telling us the truth. Jesus is trying to point us to a reality, because he is fully human, yes, but he's fully divine as well. And he says, and it's the only time that this word is used, it's a loan word from Persian language. It's a loan word like chandelier is in English from the French. He says, paradise. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Now, for most of us, wondering about what's on the other side and why is it going to be and what it's going to be like, and I don't know about you, but there have been times when I've been close to death and I felt more afraid of dying than I have been about being dead. And that's legitimate. And that's real. But hear the word of Jesus, my friends. Today, which means there's not going to be this long delay. There's not this emptiness. There's not some waiting period that he's talking about with this person who has called him by name and asked him to remember him. There's no separation time. Today, where are you going to be? With me. I'm going to be with you in a way that is more intimate, more profound than anything you could ask or imagine in your sentient being. And the thing is, we're going to see much later in the teachings that it is this Jesus who was on the cross, it was the same Jesus with us in the paradise, because he would show his wounds after the resurrection. Today, you will be with me in paradise. And that loan word was a word picture of a walled garden in the king's palace, where people would walk with the king and have private conversations away from the ears of all the courtiers and everyone who was serving around. It was a time of intimacy. It was a word picture Jesus was showing. When it's your time, when it's my time, it's personal. And I will be with you. And you will be with me. And when we layer in the other parts of his teaching, it'll be with him in a place that's prepared for us. I've said often during funerals that we imagine, how does this take place? And I remember growing up when my mom worked at a florist and my dad would come get her, and sometimes we would be there when there were funerals or weddings and they were having to do all kinds of stuff, and I would fall asleep on the back seat of the car as we were going home late at night, and I would somehow wake up in my own room the next morning, and I wouldn't understand how I got there. I just remember getting in the back of the car and falling asleep, but I would wake up in my own room, and I asked one time, I said, how does that happen? And my dad would say, well, I carried you. We're carried. We're received. And I pray that during this time of fear and anxiety, that we start to accept that it's not just for hope in this life that Christ has come. It is for a hope that we will be together. It is for a hope of recognition and reunion with each other. And oh, by the way, not once did Jesus look at him and say, well, before you do that, you've got to clean your life up. He didn't turn to him and say, well, did you really repent of everything you did? Or, hey, we've got to see about how we baptize you before this happens. To the shepherd of our souls, who is the only judge, and the only one who has the right to judge any of us. The simple, heartfelt cry to a man who saw another man dying and recognized in him the gift of life and truth says, Jesus, remember me. And maybe that's all we have in us right now. Maybe that's the mustard seed. That's all we have in us is we don't understand all the rest, but Jesus, please remember me. And he responded, and he gave the gift of life, and he gave the gift of hope immediately. Today, you will be with me in paradise. God bless you. Have a good week.
Stand. Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man could ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this latest performance of the David Wesley Virtual Choir. You can check out the rest of my YouTube channel and subscribe for more a cappella worship videos. These virtual choir projects take many months to put together. They involve singers from around the world recording in their basements, in their bedrooms, in their closets. But more than that, it's made possible by my patrons on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the creation of projects like this in the future, you can head to patreon.com/DavidWesley.